I was okay with either answer. That's up to them. I'm not going to force my faith down somebody's throat, but I'm willing to share it with whoever would like to hear it. So Jesus would always say, let those who have ears hear. If you want to listen, hear it. If you're not going to listen, there's nothing I can do. Rabbi Friedman always said, people will not listen to you unless they're moving towards you, unless they care about you and want to hear from you. And I agree with them. I've wasted a lot of time, energy, and words on people who could care less what my point of view was. Argue with your kids, argue with your grandkids, argue with anybody who doesn't want to hear what you have to say. You're wasting your time. And there's sometimes you just want to say, I understand you're not going to like this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I've done that. But that's information they may come back to later. But, you know, if somebody wants to believe in a vindictive God and not willing to hear a different side, I think just saying, I don't believe that, causes them to question, well, why wouldn't you? They'd have to assume that as a pastor, I know the stories. So why do you see it different? But this is an easy one that we can all go to. Jesus reveals to us who God is because Jesus is God. And if we want to know what God's will for us is, we look to the person of Jesus. His words, his actions, and his teachings, his life. That's God's will.
But Jesus was the Word who was with God from the very beginning. Then when those more horrible things happened in the Old Testament, it grieved his heart of the Father, what was the Father was doing. I don't know, it's like you say, our revelation of him in the New Testament is he never, like you said, he healed, cast out demons, all these good things.
Yeah, maybe this is part of my process of thinking. I'm a process kind of person. But I don't, Abraham and God continued to grow as they learned about each other and trusted one another more. The relationship grew, the expectations grew, the faith of Abraham grew, but also so did the trust in God, where it could actually reach a point where God could say, if I ask you to sacrifice your son, I trust that you'll do it. And Abraham saying, having the faith to say, I know that whatever you do for me will be good. And I'll do it. And that's kind of the culmination of this relationship building. I think the relationship building with Israel continues, and now that relationship has reached a point where God now sends Jesus, and that relationship now is shifting again. The story continues as God continues that relationship work that he's done. But God continues to do new things. He doesn't just keep doing the same thing over and over and over. He did the covenant with Abraham, he did the covenant on Mount Sinai, with the Ten Commandments that we have, saying, you're my people, I delivered you, I chose you, I brought you out, I'm setting you in this land. I expect you now to fulfill the promise that I made to Abraham so that you will become a nation so all people will know me and be blessed by you, through you, by knowing me. And they didn't, and it's taken away, and here we go. It's just an ongoing, continuing saga, I think, of God's relationship with Israel that is now coming through the person of Jesus. So it's not just God only acts one way, and there's no other way for him to act. Except I always think God acts in a loving manner to try to bring his people back to their intended purpose. And then you got to see discipline as love and not as vindictive. If I don't get my way, you're being vindictive with me. Well, come on.
If you didn't believe that God was letting us sort of do things, I think an example of that would be Chuck Colson. And here was a guy that he was a terrible person. He was a hatchet man for Nixon, you know, and he ended up in jail. And then look what happened to him. Talk about turning yourself around.
Right.
And despite everything being against him being able to do that, he was able to do it. We read about young people today that are born in the worst situations, gang and you know, and some of them you'll read about one who pulls themselves away from that. Yet everything, it looked like it was all predicted. He was the person who was going to fail. and they make it.
Yeah, and that's one of the messages that is consistent in the New Testament, and that is that if we turn to God, we will live. We can find life through Him. And so baptism then for the early church was that symbolism of drowning the old self and rising to new life. And the new life is living life with a totally new understanding of what life is about and how we go about living it, what God intends for us, and the purpose He has for us so that we can accomplish that. And it's absolutely life-changing. The person that Pastor Don worked with so much, the young man that we met in the hospital as he was dying, 19 or 20, and he had his arm filleted. His arm was about this big. And it's not because he was heavy set. He was a bodybuilder, but his arms weren't big from muscles. He got a flesh-eating infection, and they cut his arm, split it right down the middle, and it's filleted open, trying to somehow get enough antibiotics and things into that to save his life. They thought they were going to have to amputate his arm. And this young man was hooked on heroin, and he took a bad needle. And that's how he got the infection. Pastor Don worked with him, and he would show great sparks of moving forward and turning his life around, and then all of a sudden he'd drop off the face of the earth and wouldn't return calls, and he would just kind of abandon people who were supporting him. That's why community is so important, I believe. But anyway, and you could pretty much tell that followed the addiction pattern as he slipped back into the addiction. Finally, he ended up in prison. He was driving a car, and the passenger was killed. He was sent away for manslaughter. And now he's out. He used the time in prison to get his life straight, to get off of his addiction. He would come in to complain that they wouldn't let him drive, and I said, good. And, and he wanted me to go to bat for him to get his license, and I wouldn't. I said, I'm not trying to restrict your movement from not driving. I think you need the company of people. And if being in a car with someone and having those relationships, and you're dependent upon those relationships to continue by being in that car with you, that's what I want to see happen. I don't want to see you be alone again. He's now married, has a child, and works as a drug rehab counselor in San Juan. I'm doing great. And can God change people? Absolutely. But I think it takes a community to help people do that. That to me is why the church is so important. Left to myself, even myself or my understanding of God, I'm going to struggle. I think the therapists that I know will always say, all therapists have coaches for themselves. They do not believe that because they do therapy with others that they don't need help themselves. So God helps us by putting some people and coaches in our life to help encourage us and get us through time. We're not meant to be self-sufficient. He placed us in communities and in families, and we're supposed to use those families to support and encourage one another. We're not supposed to do it by ourselves. So look at the people who look at the famous people who kind of blow up. And I won't use politics, that's too easy. I'll use the church, that's a little harder, but it's also pretty easy. Look at all the great people, nationally known people in churches that have blown up. And you wonder why. Well, part of it is the isolation. The more famous you are, the more isolated you become. And pretty soon, there's an acting out. It's called the Lone Ranger syndrome. That is, you begin not to trust people, not to share, not to have the coaches, not to have accountability. You tend to go off. So we need that in our lives. We need people to be